Okay. For tonight's class session, we're going to talk a bit about research ethics. So let me pull up the slides here for everybody. Give me a quick thumbs up if you can see the slides. All right, good there. Open my chat window again. All right, quick just show of hands, and you can do like a virtual hand raise or a virtual thumbs up. Has anybody ever worked on a research project that involved human subjects? Yes or no? A couple folks. Has anybody had to do one that required you to go through an IRB approval process to actually do the research? Okay. So, well, we'll talk about research ethics, right? And obviously, the thing that you at least probably, if anything, you could take away from this is that there are at places that do research a thing called Institutional Review Board, which is IRB. IRB is really common. The few places it's most common are university settings where there's research being conducted, and then like hospitals and government facilities that do clinical trials, clinical research, social research, those type of places. IRB is, and we'll talk a little bit about it, but IRB is basically a process by which organizations that do a lot of research set up an organizational body that's job it is for you to basically, when you want to do research, you have to put together a proposal for what your research is going to be, anytime that human participants are required. So this is, you don't use IRB if you're doing like secondary data analysis or things where you, right, you're just getting like Census Bureau data or whatever like that, right? But if you are going to use human subjects, before you have approval to do that, you'll put a proposal together for that research, send it to IRB, and IRB will review and either ask you a number of questions. They may just approve it if everything seems, up and up, right? But their goal is to look at the role of human subjects in research within the organization that they're responsible for to make sure that research is being conducted ethically. There are some nuances about how IRB procedures operate at different places. So, some universities, if you're a faculty member doing research, that it's going to be published, that you would go through IRB. Some universities, if it's for class, you may not have to do IRB at all if it's for like a class research project or something like that. Kind of varies. Sometimes it depends on whether if it's for an assignment only or if it is going to be more than an assignment, like if you try to publish it or something like that. Depends on the institution. So, I always want to be familiar with these things. But, if there's anything you remember about research ethics in general, the most important thing is probably knowing what IRB is, and understanding when, like what its purpose is and when it might be required. Right. Ethical issues in social research, though, is broader than just IRB, right? IRB people are trained in this idea of understanding what is good and bad research and what is ethical and what are the trade-offs of doing research relative to the impact on the human participants in that process. Ethics, obviously, we talk about standards of conduct for a given professional group, right? So we're talking about standards of conduct for researchers, specifically in this area, like what is the normal standard of conduct for dealing with people when doing research, right? Research is a voluntary process, at least it is now. It used to not be, but right, the idea here is that when you do research, right, people who participate in the research are doing a favor to the researcher, right? No individual piece of research is so important or profound or impactful by its nature that people's participation is required or compelled, right? People used to think that like, if I'm doing this research, if I'm doing research, they're going to have huge societal impacts that everybody should have to participate in this, or that like, not so much everybody, right? But if we were using, detained persons in an incarceration facility, for example, right? People would say, well, this research is really important. These prisoners, right, are already a captive audience. And so we should be able to do this research and have, sort of coerce them into participation or require their participation because they, are prisoners and they shouldn't be able to have a choice otherwise. We don't really think that way so much anymore, even though that some people still feel that way, right? But the idea that like nobody should be required to participate, and so opt out and consent, right? Much like when you deal with like HIPAA data and what people do and do not do with your information, right? This is big in the EU now. It's a little less so in America, right? But the idea that like your data about you is yours to control, and you should have the choice to not have it shared or to not have it collected, right? The same is true of research, that like you shouldn't be required to participate. That said, right, there's this balance of what is in the best interest of science and what is ethical, right? And you know, generally things that are heavily unethical are probably not things that we should be doing, right? But we've talked about kind of deception and experiments and things like that, where it gets a little fuzzier in terms of there is scientific value, but there is sort of some potential harm, right? And what is that, right? And then in that gray area, right, there's more and less value, right? Lying to somebody about the purpose of the research, but having them just take a survey and watch a film is probably not so traumatic. Having somebody compelled to participate or asking them to participate where they're trying a very experimental drug that has side effects and consequences of taking it, many to which are unknown and undetermined, right? In exchange for potentially treating a condition that they have, right, is a little bit more of a complicated situation, right? And so, you know, there are on the very extreme, right? There are, you know, Nazi war crimes against people where they just wanted to experiment on prisoners because they wanted to do things in the name of science and they didn't care about the lives of those humans, right? Very extreme example, right? But the point is that in the middle, we have to be worried about the trade-off between good science and the impact of the evidence that is created and what the impact on the participants are, right? The book, you know, they'll talk about whether it's possible to balance these two. I think the short answer is like it is, but like anything else, right? It's a cost benefit analysis to be made, and there is a calculation in terms of how much risk versus how much benefit of participating is there in this specific study, and that varies study to study, right? And so when we talk about these ethical principles, there's a number of different ethical principles, right? That some of them stem from, right? We talk about the Nuremberg trials and, you know, trying war criminals from, you know, Nazi Germany that experimented on people, right? And sort of these principles that came out of that that now guide our understanding of what research ethics is, right? One of them is this idea of do no harm, right? Ideally, you know, we never want to harm the participant. The participant is a volunteer, right? And so that is a primary goal of their participation, is not to harm them in the research, right? Where this is, again, fuzzy is when we're talking about, right, well, if you think about physical, mental, emotional, social, psychological, all types of potential harm, right? There are extremes, and then there are sort of more reasonable sort of applications that have some potential harm impact, right? If you're familiar with the Tuskegee syphilis study, right? What the government decided to do was inject a bunch of Black soldiers with syphilis and not tell them that they were doing that because they wanted to study the effect of syphilis on persons. And so they didn't consent and they didn't know they were participating because they were in the military at the time. And so we just thought we could do what we wanted. We injected them with this condition and monitored what happened, right? That is, you know, you know, there are maybe some, you know, especially if we think about like Nazis, right? There are much worse types of physical harm that we could do, but that's not ideal, right? Like injecting somebody with an infectious disease is quite problematic, especially if you choose not to treat it because you want to see what happens if it is untreated or left untreated. That is a severe level of right, participant harm that you are participating in, especially when you are not compensating those folks for that participation. They are not aware of and informed of the potential risk, right? That is a level of harm that is extreme beyond what we basically see anymore in types of research. The Stanford Prison Experiment was another example. Anybody ever watched the Stanford Prison Experiment? There's a movie about it that came out not too long ago. Or show of hands, has anybody even heard about this experiment in general? Okay, so a few of you, right? The idea was we wanted to understand the relationship and the dynamic between prisoners and inmates in an artificial setting to see like what happens with power dynamics. So they basically created a fake prison environment within a basement in the part of Stanford's campus, and they basically were doing sociology, psychology type research. And then everybody, we coin tossed, people participated, knew what they were getting themselves into in terms of like what the experiment was. But we said, okay, you're going to be a guard, you're going to be a prisoner, you're going to be a guard, you're going to be a prisoner, right? And then, for lack of a better term, shit hit the fan very quickly in terms of doing this, where, right, there were violent outbursts by the guards against the prisoners. The prisoners were staging, right? They were trying to fight back and escape, right? They were being treated poorly, right? And things that, like, these were not, right, severe convicts and correctional officers that were put into this scenario. These were mostly like college age students or campus people that were put into an artificial environment and began acting in a way that is well beyond what we expected, right? If that were to happen, a good researcher could obviously, first sign of problem, intervene and shut it down, right? Where it gets to be more absurd in this scenario is that it happened for multiple days, and things got worse and progressively worse before anybody decided to step in, right? Because the idea was, well, this is very interesting in terms of what is happening, and for the research, we want to see where this goes, right? And so we allowed people to continue to harm themselves or harm other people in this environment for the purposes of the research, when in actuality, right, like these were voluntary people, the people who were in the jail cell who said, I no longer want to participate, I want to leave, who were then told by the correctional guard folks that they can't leave and that they would be, abused and have their privileges taken away, right, if they try to escape and those type of things. And it's like, this is research, right? It's like if somebody asked you to participate in a customer satisfaction survey for Best Buy, and then if you didn't complete it, we threw you in a basement and locked you in there for 3 days. And right, like that idea seems a bit odd to us, that would even be an option. Right, so these are like two really famous examples, but the idea being that, right, informed consent, this idea that people are voluntarily participating, they should know what the risk is involved, what the benefit of the research is, right? And so, if you look at any type of research, if you do like an IRB proposal, one of the things they're going to ask you is, well, let me see your consent documentation, right? Typically, there's a page or two that before anybody participates or even does a survey or anything more than a survey, it says, here's who I am, here's my research goal, right? This is what this research entails. The benefit or the perceived benefit of the information we're going to get from this research is A, B, and C, right? We anticipate little or no or some risk of participating, and here's what it is, right? All that information is available so that the person can choose whether or not they want to participate, right? And you should give them the option that at any point in the research process, they can also withdraw their consent and determine on their own if the risk outweighs the benefit to them to where they no longer want to participate, right? So that's really kind of a key principle, initially. There are things where it gets a little bit more complicated in terms of, right, well, if we are doing a study of veterans with post-traumatic stress and we really want to better understand the conditions that may have triggered, that may have led to post-traumatic stress or triggered post-traumatic stress type episodes in them, that may require discussions of those previous events or current circumstances that are triggering these episodes, right? And that is not necessarily an unharmful thing to do, to have that conversation or put somebody in that conversation, right? So that is also where it gets a little bit where, right, the benefit and benefit cost trade-off discussion have to be a little more prevalent, right? Like most people, unless it's a paper survey and you get a paper cut, right? Like it's not probably going to be so harmful, right? But if you're having a conversation about like, I want to relive your experiences in Vietnam and have you revisit like when you think you started like maybe having these type of episodes, or you really felt like the trauma occurred to you, that is the type of conversation it's not easy to have, right? That is a type of either mental or psychological or emotional harm to relive those experiences. Not necessarily that you can't do it, right? But that it has to be, right, understood in the context of what is the value of this research and putting somebody through that. And do I have the proper protocols in place that if they want to stop, they can walk away from this? In those type of scenarios, oftentimes where researchers will have like a psychologist or a psychiatrist or somebody that's also part of the research, so that afterwards, right, somebody is well trained and prepared to sort of talk them back down and out of that, right? and to provide support that they need to, right, kind of stabilize them emotionally, right? So, right, those type of things are part of that kind of protocol so that you try to minimize harm in general if there is some risk, right? And the reason why you might still have some risk is because we feel like, well, the benefit of understanding these things may help us to be able to better understand what causes post-traumatic stress type treatment or symptoms or events, to be able to really mitigate that from happening to future people, or to be able to better treat people with this condition. We need to understand these things, right? It's like, that is not an arbitrary level of value of that research, right? So there's a high benefit, but again, there is also no harm happening to the people participating. So again, there's a calculation and they have to be informed of what that is, right? You know, if it's like, this is for a homework assignment and I really just want to talk to a bunch of people who are veterans and have them relive these really traumatic experiences, like that's a good amount of harm relative to no benefit. You could do your homework assignment on something else, right? And so like, those are the type of calculations that come into play here. These three principles the book talks about, right? Thinking about, okay, what things should I think about when I'm thinking about whether my research is ethical, right? Autonomy being, right, again, this is part of the idea of consent. Participation is voluntary. People know what's involved, what is expected of them, what they are being asked to do, and they can choose whether they want to participate or not, right? Beneficence, again, this idea that there is no harm being done, right? And then justice, the idea that benefits, right? You consider this equity as well. Benefits and burdens of the research are shared fairly, right? You know, you don't want to, I don't know who would do something like this, right? But if you have a drug trial where you want to have a control group and a treatment group, right? And you either have a very promising drug offered to Asian and white patients, and Black and Hispanic Latino populations are considered the control group, right? That is not equal benefit and burden, right? There's a disparity in the way that is being implemented. At the same time, right, things that have greater risk being administered to persons of color, and the things that are considered not risky, the control group or whatever it is, being in sort of the lower risk category, right? Those type of things. It does get a little bit more tricky when you think about things like, you know, in health research, we talk about like, you know, like a sickle cell condition, which, you know, over-representatively impacts Black African-American populations more than it does others, right? That doesn't necessarily mean you can't do research on that topic, because the benefits are also disproportionately going to impact that group, as would sort of the burden of that research, right? So it's a little bit different when there's something like there's a specific group, you know, if you're looking like tribal Native American populations on tribal reservations, if you are singling out those populations because you just think that they, you know, are nearby and should participate, right? And it's like, I'm doing a study on obesity and I think native tribal, you know, tribal populations have an obesity problem. That may be true, right? But the benefit may be to a larger population than just Native Americans. And so it's probably not fair to put that burden on all of them. Now, if you're thinking about implementing services or programs on tribal reservations, and so that is the population you intend to study because you want to see if a treatment works so that you can expand it or roll it out further in those locations. Right? Again, that gets to where benefit and burden is a little bit more equitable, because a population is being studied for the purpose of providing that population the benefit. And so it's not sort of problematically inequitable, if that makes sense. Any questions about those kind of concepts, principles? This is more a little bit about just participation and data management. If people do participate, these two things get kind of mixed up, right, from time to time. But if you are having people participate in your research, there are questions of whether you all will allow anonymous or confidential participation. The difference being anonymous means no one can be identified by a given response of a respondent, right? So if you do a survey and you don't ask anybody their name at all, it is anonymous, right? I don't need your name to do my research, right? I may ask you demographic questions, but if I'm asking just sort of your, you know, your age in very large buckets, right? 18 to 35, 36 to 50, so on and so forth. I'm asking your race and ethnicity. I'm asking your sex or gender, right? The zip code you live in, right? None of those data elements in and of themselves, or even taken together, will necessarily make it easy to identify a single person. So, if we didn't collect their name or their email or their specific date of birth or anything like that, then it is anonymous, right? Confidentiality is a little different. Confidentiality means I know who you are, I know your name, I know your specific address, I might know your actual date of birth, right? But anything that we publish as a result of this research, we'll strip that information from you, right? This is important because, like, you can imagine a scenario where I'm doing a survey on, here's a good example, like in the health department, right? We have patients that come in for HIV, STD treatment, they come in for tuberculosis treatment, they come in for a number of different types of healthcare procedures and services, right? If I want to do a customer satisfaction survey where we got the email addresses of everybody who came to our clinics over the last 6 months, and I send out an email blast to every single one of those email addresses, and I say, we want to know how your experiences were. Can you provide answers to this survey that ask you whether or not you got timely service, the quality of care was good, blah, 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 right? If I send it out to everybody and I don't ask them their name, their email address, or like their patient ID number, I just ask them, like, was the quality of care you received good? Did you have an easy time getting an appointment? Like those type of things, it's an anonymous survey, right? They can answer all those questions to me. That data is useful without me having to know who they are. Therefore, I don't need to ask it, it's anonymous, right? Confidentiality is the idea that if I know who you are and I say, you specifically received HIV or AIDS treatment from so-and-so, right? We would like to understand a little bit more about your experiences as a person of color getting treated in our clinics. We're also wanting to do the same thing with persons, right, white or Caucasian persons. So we're looking to understand if there's a difference between how our physicians treat persons of color from persons, of Caucasian descent. Right? Well, we can't really do that anonymously necessarily because we may need to find specific people, right, who by name were treated for certain conditions, who are in our clinics that we can invite, right? Taking the data and that information that is connected to them, but saying, when we present these results, we're going to talk broadly about the trends in terms of, right, 72% of patients said that they had a disappointing or less than average level of quality experience with their provider, right, who were of color. People who were of Caucasian descent had a 72% satisfaction level, right? If we report it in that way, then it's confidential, right? Because nothing that we're saying is like going to identify a single person, even though the data we have underneath and underlying specifically tells us, like, we know who they were. We had to talk to them individually. We have their name, their date of birth, who they saw, right? We had all that information when we did the research. We just left it confidential so that everything we reported out. We didn't share the data. We didn't let anybody know who the persons were or where they lived, right? We just gave aggregate information that makes it impossible to identify them. That's an example of having confidentiality in your research as opposed to anonymity. That makes sense? Questions about that, the difference? Right. We talked about deception. Deception obviously sometimes is required. You can't always tell everybody what the purpose of your research is and have it not impact what they choose to do. So it's okay to do it to a certain degree. Again, obviously it depends on how much you're lying to them and what the intent of the deceit is. But it's fine to do in certain circumstances, again, as long as you also have that debriefing where afterwards, right, you come clean about what you did and why you couldn't tell them, and you get, again, informed consent, right? You re-request consent from them afterwards to make sure that they are fine with still continuing to have their data used, knowing that they were deceived in the first place, right? Analysis and reporting, right? The book talks about this idea that, right, to your colleagues in the scientific community, there's an ethical obligation, right? The big thing about really ethics and transparency, ethical reporting in the scientific communities, it's really about transparency and being open about your findings and your methods and your process, right? The scientific method is such that everybody should use the same type of method, right? And that there's a process to how people do science, right? A lot of times now, if you want to get any piece of research published, outlets that do publications require additional stuff, right? Where before, and you've probably read some of these examples, right? If you look at a journal article, it says generally, right, what they studied, But if you actually really like, there's in my PhD program, one of the good assignments that people were asked to do in like a research methods class was like find a journal article you're interested in and then replicate the study that you found. And by the idea of scientific transparency, everybody should have a pretty easy time, right? If you tell me your methods, and you tell me your data sources, and you tell me your process, I should be able to basically do the same thing and come to the same result. You'd be surprised how often that is not the case, because people don't necessarily talk about all the changes they made to the data set that they had, or the fact that they excluded certain criteria or parameters, or that, right, that they had, you know, they didn't find maybe a significant result the first couple of times and made some changes to their methods, right? And so what they actually reported on is sort of a variation, or they weren't descriptive enough to basically say all those things. I wouldn't say it's unethical, right? But it is problematic in the sense that you are not being open and transparent. And the point of scientific research and knowledge production is that people should be able to know what has been found by people doing research, and they should know how they found it, right? It's kind of like telling you, like, I know how to cook the world's greatest pizza, and trust me, I have a recipe, and you can make it at home, right? And then I basically tell you, like, all you need is an oven and some flour and some cheese, right, and some water, and you can make it in an hour, right? Like that kind of tells me, right? But like, I don't know how much flour, I don't know what type of cheese, right? Like an hour, is it all an hour in the oven? Is it 45 minutes in the oven after 15 minutes of preparation, right? Like recipes are very specific so that you can follow it exactly. Scientific research should be the same so that people can see what you did. And if they think they are a good researcher, critique what you did or add value to what you've done and understand that, right? So, right, thinking about both being transparent about what you do, also the limitations, right? No, you know, there's I can't remember. It was a methods course I took where we talking about like models, right, and statistical modeling, right? There's some quote from some researcher who basically the gist of it was like all models are bad, some are just much worse than others, right? So like the idea that like when you do research or you produce a model, you are oversimplifying reality intentionally for the purposes of research, right? Like the world is way too complicated to be boiled down to like 12 variables and however you choose to measure them, right? And like I'm going to say that knowing darn well that this entire semester is teaching you how to do good research by simplifying the world into 12 variables, right? And measuring them in an unsatisfactory way, right? Not a flawed way, right? But like, right, if you think about the idea of like, what is depression, right? Depression is a very complex, convoluted thing that isn't probably like a 12 survey question answer type of concept, right? But that's what we do. And that's what we have to do to make research happen. And that's okay, right? But that means there are also limitations, and you are making trade-offs in terms of the models you use and the overgeneralizations and simplification of the stuff that you're studying to make it researchable, right? And so by that logic, there are limitations, right? Nobody's proposals or designs are perfect in the world. Some are really, really bad and others are less bad, right? Our goal is to be the least bad we possibly can be, but like, it doesn't mean it's a perfect piece of research. There is no such thing, right? So the goal is, you know, especially like even for your proposals, right? You are going to make decisions about how you design your research. Right, there's different choices you can make, right? If you want to understand how a program impacts somebody's overall physical health and well-being, there's 100 different ways you can measure physical health and well-being, right? Some are good, many are good. Some are bad, many are bad. You're gonna have to choose one, right? The goal is that in that proposal, in your justification, you say why you chose the one that you chose and what's good about it. And if there's a limitation or a reason why it's not perfect, and you know what that is, you should also say why that is. Right? It doesn't mean that there's a better option, right? It's not like somebody gave me the choice of having $10 and $20, and I chose 10 for no good reason other than I wanted less money, right? It's like I found $10 and finding $10 is great. Would I have liked to have found 20? Yes, but finding 20 wasn't available, right? I'm aware of the fact that there's a difference between good and great, right? But in the circumstance I'm in, I'm telling you what I've got and what I've done and how it maybe could be better, or like what the drawback is, not having any better option at the time. That makes sense? Right. So a good ethical researcher is good about when you report and you write up your proposal, your final study, you talk about both the ethical precautions that you took in doing your research. You talk about your process transparently so that people can follow it if they want to. You provide, right? And so if you're a SPSS or a SAS or a Python coder, right? A lot of people now will share their actual code and their data set and their code book and data dictionary, right? So that if anybody's interested, they can replicate and understand, right, to a T every single step that you took along the way. We've talked about IRB, right? Typically, it's not always a faculty panel. At universities, it's typically always faculty plus some administrators. Sometimes there's IRB staff. We have an IRB at the Department of Public Health. Department of Health Services in LA County also has an IRB. Health Services runs all of the county hospitals. So their IRB is doctors and medical researchers because they are reviewing proposals about like clinical trials and clinical research. They are not social researchers, so their research proposals come to our IRB, as does everybody else in public health. We have doctors and people like me and people who are researchers, none of which, well, some of us are faculty members on the side, right? But our job is not primarily faculty members. We have government positions, so we constitute the IRB in those scenarios. And so that is a different example of like what an IRB might look like in another setting where it's not all just faculty members. Professional code of ethics, the most relevant one for you all is probably APSA, the American Society for Public Administration, ASPA, right? They have a code of ethics, right? Professional organizations or jobs that you might be part of also sometimes have code of ethics. And so it's important to know if there is one, especially in terms of, most of the time they're about conduct, right? But research might be a type of conduct. So if you are a researcher or an analyst or something like that, and you're a member of these organizations, that you understand sort of those other pieces, right? Like probably in the practical professional world of doing research, these are really the only two kind of things that are going to have, I don't say an impact, but like the only two corollaries to like your ethical decisions about doing research, right? If there's an IRB, you have to go through that process. Professional code of ethics may tell you that you as a professional in this field should do certain things. And right, it's, if you have a license or something like that, which analysts do not, there's obviously, you can't lose your license, right? If you have a professional code of ethics that you violate as a doctor or a lawyer or those type of jobs, then right, certainly there's impacts of that. Other than probably like, if you work at a workplace that requires training and certification for people who do research, right? So like we have a similar process where even if you're not going to do research right away, if you ever want to apply for any research to IRB, we require you to have a certain type of certification and have certain trainings done that the prerequisite to applying to IRB, right? So like there may be those other practical factors where we say, if you're going to be a researcher, right, we don't do this for most analytical jobs, but we may say like you need to have these certifications before you can be hired, or once you're hired, right, the government mandates that you do certain trainings, which includes this research ethics course. Those are probably the most likely places that research ethics would practically come into play in sort of a day-to-day public sector, public administration type of job. That makes sense? Questions about that? All right. Again, ethics here, do no harm. We talked about this. Honesty, this is really both transparency in your research, but also, again, other than the deception piece that we've talked about, right, disclosing, what you're intending to do with the research, its purpose, all of that information to the participants, how it's going to be used after the fact, what you're going to do with their data, blah, 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 right? Also, honesty in terms of what were your methods, your assumptions, biases you have, limitations of your research, where you got your data from, all of those things in terms of actually reporting. Accuracy, right? I mean, the logic here basically is like, it is, I don't call it unethical, but it is problematic if you spend a lot of time putting together a research project that you're asking a lot of people to spend their time participating in, and you do a really shoddy job of analyzing the results or writing up your report or anything like that, right? It's not really necessarily unethical, right? But it is a bad use of those persons' time, and it is wasteful and inefficient, if nothing else, right? So there is sort of an obligation to, like, nothing is going to be perfect again, right? But that right? If you say you're going to ensure confidentiality or anonymity, that you do that, right? That you protect people's data, that you do rigorous high quality analysis to make sure that like you are not over promising and under delivering in what you think that you're going to do. Technical correctness, right? This is, you got to do the math right. Otherwise, your research just is not useful because you've mathematically or computationally done things that are wrong. You know, statistics, analysis, charts, now more so, not just technically correct, but unbiased, right? There are ways of presenting data in a way that fits a narrative or enforces sort of a political argument that you want to make, right? And obviously there's a book, if anybody's interested, called like How to Lie with Statistics. And it talked a lot about, right, this idea of like how you can present information graphically or visually from data in different ways and how it looks like it communicates very different points, right? And things like think tanks that have a partisan leaning and things like that. You ever wonder why they're always able to do research that finds support for the exact argument that they had in the first place, right? Probably a reason for that. And it's probably the reason why we don't trust the research that comes out of those groups. But that is also some of this like technical correctness, accuracy piece. Reliable, valid measures and objectivity. We're going to talk a lot about just research design and good research design here, right? But the general gist of it, again, is being objective, transparent, right? Not letting your own personal values or beliefs or any of those things impact or adversely taint the research or the findings, right? And this is why we teach you a research proposal first, right? Because the idea is, as a critical thinking, open-minded person, right, you have an idea, you have a hypothesis, you figure out what you think you expect, right? You set up the design for how you would get the information that you need to test that hypothesis, and you analyze and find out were you right or wrong, right? And it's okay to have a theory that ends up being right, right? That your theory should be informed by knowing something about whatever you're studying, but at the same time, you have to be open to the idea that like, if you think something and you don't end up proving that thing, that either you need to do more research because the way that you designed this study isn't accurate to get the information you need, or if you do 15 different studies 15 different ways and you continue to get the same result, maybe your theory is wrong, right? You know, if I have a theory that like, if I eat nothing but Oreos and chips all day long, I will lose weight, right? I don't know how I came up with this theory, but if I have that theory, right, I'd love for that to be true, right? And if I do that for 15 days in a row and I don't lose any weight, right, and I say, well, something's wrong, right? Obviously, I know this theory to be true, and I do it again, I do it again, I do it again, and I keep gaining weight, right? At a certain point in time, I have to accept the premise that that is not a true theory, that eating chips and Oreos all day long is not going to cause me to lose weight, right? That is the part where we move from, right, a researcher to a critical thinker and consumer of information, where unfortunately, regrettably in America these days, right, not everybody lets new information impede their brain space and cause them to change their beliefs because, you know, I love chips and I love Oreos and I'm not going to change what I think because I want them to be healthy and so I'm going to keep eating them anyway, right? That is problematic mindset, right? It's the one thing to say they're delicious and they're not good for you, but I'm going to keep having them because I want them, right? That is not a flawed logic or reasoning. It's another thing to choose to believe that like they are good for me or that they cause me to lose weight because like, you know, it was the idea of correlations, not causation, right? Like if I have a massive surgery and I, you know, I just got diagnosed with cancer and I have a major surgery and I'm losing tons of weight because of cancer, but also I'm eating nothing but chips and Oreos while I'm receiving cancer treatment. Right? You can't say the chips and Oreos cause you to lose weight in that research design, right? Because for 100 other people, right, that trend wouldn't be true. And this again goes back to like one person's trend is not necessarily true of the whole population. That's why we have to look at like broad trends to see if there's evidence for them, right? So we have to be good consumers of information. We have to understand objectively, like, you know, if I do it over and over and over again, right, it's a definition of insanity, expecting the same result, right? That's a problem. And eventually you have to allow the information to tell you, I've done 5 different studies, 5 different ways on this topic. And every time I found out that X is not related with Y, right? Then you need to accept that X is not related with Y until somebody proves otherwise. Make sense? politics and social research, they talk a little bit about this in the book, right? This goes back to this idea of like think tanks, right? Partisan people who try to find, I don't want to say, I don't want to air quote them, but they are partisan. They may not want to pretend like they are partisan. They try to pretend like they are independent and neutral, critical thinkers, right? But in reality, people fund research. Some people fund it for the purposes of charity because they think it's useful for people to do research, and they give grants and they give money for unbiased, objective science to happen because they want to know what people can discover about the world. Other times, right, I am a researcher and I am an evaluator, and I have a client who is paying me to do an evaluation, and that client really wants me to find evidence that their program achieves the goals that they aim to achieve. Right? That scenario can put some hindrances on objectivity or the quality of one's research, especially if you have lots of pressure from somebody who's paying you to find something or to meet deadlines or to do things a certain way, right? Sometimes it's not as like obvious as like find me evidence that this program meets these goals, but it's like I'm only going to give you a certain amount of time, a certain amount of resources. I really want you to use certain data. That data is going to come from my staff that they're going to give you to use, and now I don't know how accurate is that data, or how did anybody mess with this data or take out outliers or selectively choose observations. Right? Those pressures come into play. The other things, like with some of the like partisan research groups, they only put their research into certain areas. Obviously, they could do research on anything, but they don't, right? They try to find evidence that supports specific political arguments. And there's an incentive, obviously, because like if I want people to, I'll use the example. If I want people to believe climate change isn't real, I'm going to pay people to do research to find evidence that climate change isn't a real, or that evidence that climate change is not necessarily guaranteed or proven yet, right? So there's an incentive, especially if I'm paying those people and they work for me and they already think that it's not, to try to do whatever they can to devise their research to meet the objective, as opposed to do the research and let the objective be whatever the research says. There's a big difference between do your design first and accept the findings versus accept the findings, design your research to prove the finding. That makes sense, right? One is a lot more problematic than the other, but both happen. And so that's why not all research is also necessarily good, and you should be informed consumers, not just of information, but also of research, because people's designs might be shoddy, or people's data selection and sample choice might be shoddy, right? Or there's lots of reasons why you yourself may critique someone's research beyond what they have just chosen to say at the limitations, because, right, well, who paid for this research and who did this research? And what's the organization that published this? One of the reasons why we trust peer-reviewed academic research in general is because typically academics, other than being paid to do their job, have nothing to gain from doing their research. Journals typically are not selling research for a huge profit, right? They do make some money to keep journals running, and there's some issues with that. But right, generally, peer review means that 3 experts on this field had to review this piece of research before it got published and say it was legitimate and good. And because they've done that and they all signed off, we believe that this research has value and merit, and it wasn't done in a way that was biased or doctored or problematic. And so that is the kind of part of the how we remove some of the politics from at least academic research. There's a big problem in the fact that like people still like to publish articles that find something. There's lots of people who don't find anything, and we don't publish those results, and that's problematic in and of itself. That's a little bit more of a systemic problem. But there are, right, those type of things in the world, right, that, nowadays it's not even just research, right? It's a Facebook post or a tweet or whatever, right, that like tells you something is true when it's either just an outright lie, or it's an AI generated Russian bot that just wanted to stir up controversy, or, right, if everybody's probably, at least at some point in their life experience, like on the internet, some celebrity died and it was all over the news and they didn't actually die at all, right? Like, how did that happen? And where, like those type of things are part of the world now. And so critical information consumption is more and more important. And if you're going to be in the research field, understanding how I need to validate research is critical. This part's talked about in the book. Obviously, there's different examples. I'm not going to talk about them all because you read them already. Politics in perspective, right? Again, back to this point, like more and more today than ever, science and politics are getting woven together, not for the betterment of science, maybe not for the betterment of politics either. And that's the thing we have to be concerned about, we have to be aware of, right? And so, right, ideological considerations, you know, who's doing the research, what their motives are, right? Politics is really about the study of power and motive, and right, people's struggle for control, right? Thinking about not just what this research finds, but what, right? Thinking about behind this research, like who's the researcher and where did they do this research at and who funded it, right? And what motives might they have? Typically, we like to think if they're an academic at an institution and they did it because that's just what academics do, that there's not a problem. Maybe that's true, right? But some universities are now also created to have a ideological stint or slant to them, right? If you are a Christian fundamentalist university institution, research that comes out of that organization may also end up having a certain bias to it, or a certain perspective that is potentially problematic, right? So those are things we got to consider in terms of the sort of political landscape and sort of the politics around, you know, as much as like we like to think public administration is not politics. And so we as government folks just can do the sort of transparent, objective, administrative thing, right? Board of supervisors and city council members and senators and state senators, like they meddle in our business too. And so there are factors to consider and pressures that will come into play. Hopefully not often. My experience has been they don't understand the stuff well enough to like do a ton anyway, but they will interfere, not necessarily maliciously, right? But they'll want data that, you know, like I've heard from my constituents that A, B, and C is happening, and I need data that tells me, right, that that's true so that I can see how bad the problem is, right? And sometimes you have to stop and say, well, you don't know it's true just because one person said it. We can investigate and see if there's evidence that that is a problem, right? Just because 3 people called you and said that there's something going on doesn't mean that it's happening to everybody, right? But even those kind of small scale debates happen quite often and more than you think, because not everybody's a great researcher and data person in their day life jobs, right? So pays me a lot of money because I am, because nobody understands it. Good reason and motivator if you want to go into this field to do it yourself. But right, that's kind of the practical real world of how things work. So